Creating financial freedom is every investor's dream. Best-selling author and director of Pure Property Investment, Paul Glossop, is giving you that chance. To grab a copy of his new book, A Surfer's Guide to Property Investing, absolutely free, simply jump onto Pure Property Investment's Facebook page, hit the message button and type the words Smart Property to secure your free copy today. But hurry, this offer is limited to the first 100 people.
Welcome to the Smart Property Investment Show with your host, Phil Tarrant.
Hi everyone, how are you going? Welcome to the podcast. Thanks for joining us as we navigate this crazy world of property, and I try and keep pretty close to it and what's happening, and I'm a big reader and digester of information. I read the papers, obviously. Most days, some of them are right, some of them better than others, and as a property investor, you need to make sure you're well informed. So I guess you're tuning into the Smart Property Investment Show, so you're down that path. We've had quite a fluctuating market right across the nation, and we like to focus on various different hotspots, not spots, what spots, whatever other spots there are. But, we've been doing a lot recently in Sydney and Melbourne. There's a lot of discussions up in the Brisbane market about what's actually happening there. And I just really wanted to drill down into that today and do a bit of a focused podcast on Brisbane. I own a lot of assets up there, a lot of properties up there. Some of them I've had for it's going to be sort of 6 or so years, some of it more recent. And if you've been tuning into the Smart Property Investment Show, you'll know of some of them, but you can go and check them out. Just go to the website, smartpropertyinvestment.com.au, see what we own and buy up there. I'm sitting around been waiting for this market to move and start showing me some capital growth like a lot of other people, out of town investors who have purchased up in Brisbane recently. So I want to get to the bottom of it. To help me out with that today, Scott and Melinda Jennison. They're from Streamline Property Buyers. We're going to get everything into Brisbane and mainly deal with some of the misconceptions about Brisbane property market. Scott, Melinda, how you going? You well?
Good. Very well. Thanks for having us.
Thanks for making a trip down from Brisbane this morning to come and see us. How is it up there? Nice and warm. It's heating up.
A little bit warmer than Sydney, yeah.
Yeah. And it's coming to that time of the year, is it, where it just starts getting unlivable up there? That's why everyone's sort of moving down this way instead of moving up to Brisbane. Or it's the other way around, isn't it? Everyone's chasing Hey, what are you seeing in this whole sea change, tree change, interstate migration type stuff? Is it much of that going on?
Oh, it appears to be happening more and more. According to the data, there's record levels of interstate migration from southern states into Brisbane right now. So, it's contributing to our accelerating population growth, and it's only good for Brisbane in terms of, where it's heading.
So we love lists at Smart Property Investment. We're going to do top 10 today around misconceptions about the Brisbane property market. Now, before we get there, what are you seeing? Is there action? Is there movement in the Brisbane market? To my earlier point, are prices starting to go up and go north, which is great for us property investors?
Yeah, well, CoreLogic data is starting to show a small creep in prices, but what we're seeing on the ground is a very different story, certainly in pockets that we're quite active in, record numbers of buyers. I think there was one open inspection that I went to where there were 38 groups through the first weekend, and record number of buyers, not many properties being listed. So listing volumes over the last 12 months have dropped 14% in Brisbane for new listings. Overall listings, I think, are down about just under 5%. So a lot of older stock on the market, not a lot of new stock coming to the market. But what that's doing is it's resulting in a lot of properties going to multi-offer, and it's not a very nice way to buy a property. And a lot of properties we're seeing are actually selling for over the asking price.
So this is the dynamics of supply and demand. So more people want to buy than what properties available. So eventually there will be an equilibrium, I would imagine. So it's really a seller's market at the moment, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Good time to sell if you're wanting to get a premium price because, as I said, a lot of properties are sort of going into multi-offer, and competition creates competitiveness and, pushes prices upward.
Who's buying this stuff, investors or owner-occupiers?
Both.
Okay.
Depends on the market, I think. I think suburbs that have good owner-occupier appeal, there's certainly a lot of owners looking for their dream home, and that's what is likely to push those prices up. When investors are competing with owner-occupiers, obviously they're competing with the emotional buyers, and people that are buying on emotion tend to overpay. So, to make sure that you're competitive as an investor, it's not only important to understand the numbers, but also to understand what's driving property values in a particular area and desirability, and understanding, what owner-occupiers are looking for.
And it's really understanding what we'll get to, these misconceptions about the Brisbane property market. Now, from what I understand, you only buy in Brisbane, you Brisbane locals, and that's your backyard, and that's where you invest all your time and effort. So I reckon a lot of people from out of state probably go up there, myself included, with thinking one thing when the reality on the ground is something very different. And we'll get into those. Melinda, you seem to be the brains trust of this outfit. You've got all the numbers and the research and the facts, and I think some of this might relate to you and Scott. I know you're very hands-on. You're a builder by trade, so this gives a lot of advantages when you're looking to make quick offers in a market which seems pretty hot at the moment. So lots of things that we'll get through. And I'm going to kick off misconception number one. Now, we'll go through these and I'll make a statement and we'll just use it as just a bit of a discussion point. Distance from the CBD in Sydney and Melbourne from an investment perspective is comparable to Brisbane. What do you mean by that?
Population density is very different in Brisbane. So, our local government area for Brisbane has a much lower population density than Sydney and Melbourne. So just because you may be 15 or 20 kilometres from Brisbane CBD, it's not comparable to 20 or 30 kilometres from, the Sydney or the Melbourne CBD. So it's just really important for investors to understand the importance of distance from CBD in Brisbane. In Brisbane LGA, most of the future dwelling supply is going to come from infill development, and the future supply pipeline of greenfield land space is largely coming from the other local government areas, predominantly Ipswich and Logan.
So does this mean that density can increase rapidly in the years ahead? So that should help shape the type of stuff that you're buying. So potentially development blocks or stuff with upside potential? Yeah,
so density certainly has much higher capacity for buyers in Brisbane. So, there's a lot of infill development opportunities for people wanting to land bank for development sites and also to move into that space to manufacture additional wealth through development. But equally, it's important to understand how that future development might impact on the future supply in certain locations, because obviously the balance between supply and demand does impact on property values.
And Scott, you're a local, born and bred in Brisbane. Is that where you're?
No, originally country New South Wales.
Country New South Wales, and you ended up. Are you the?
Melinda's the local.
Melinda's the local. So, you can look at Brisbane on a map, right, and go, oh wow, it's all surrounded by water. And we're in Sydney. We're recording in Sydney, and most waterfront stuff in Sydney or the beaches is pretty nice, And I've fallen into this trap myself where I'm looking at properties and I look at a particular map and go, wow, that's right on the water. But, one of the misconceptions about the busy market, sort of point number two, is Brisbane's coastal suburbs are all desirable. Yes, there's a lot of coastline out there, but some of it's just muddy plains that you probably don't want to be near, right? This is a big misconception people have about Brisbane.
Yeah, correct. So, Brisbane's on the river and it's really affected by tide. So in low tide, there's some areas on the waterline that become mud and not water.
And that's not this glamorous thing of like white sand beaches and having a swim, right?
No, it can change the look, the smell and the mosquito side of things.
So that's a big thing, right? Like mozzies and this all sort of relates, it's very tidal, a lot of flood zones in Brisbane as well, which you don't really have in Sydney.
Yeah, correct, yeah.
So how should that shape the way in which you approach investing in property?
So I guess local knowledge is a huge part of it, which is what we pride ourselves on. We're on the ground, we know the areas, and we know the areas that are highly affected by the low tide, and also the flood, overland flow and those types of things.
When we come back, we're going to get to point number 3 of misconceptions about the Brisbane property market. Back in a moment.
The Trident Formula, created by Sam Gordon at Australian Property Scout, is the strategic way to build a profitable property portfolio. If you're looking to perfect your strategy, go to www.australianpropertyscout.com.au to book a call with Sam himself.
Welcome back, everyone. Here with Scott and Melinda Jennison from Streamline Property Buyers. We're getting into some of these misconceptions about the Brisbane property market, and I must admit I've had these ideas myself at some point in time, which have now been refuted. I think I'm a much better investor result of it. Melinda, the third misconception, the majority of employment in Brisbane is starting to decentralise. So what we're talking about there is that more jobs are going to be outside of the Brisbane CBD in the years ahead.
Yeah, that is a big misconception. So the Brisbane Economic Development Plan that takes us through to 2041 shows that more than 65% of future employment opportunities are going to be coming through Brisbane CBD. But not only that, the CBD area is growing to include suburbs like South Brisbane, Woolloongabba, Bowen Hills, Fortitude Valley, etc. So that's where the majority of jobs will be located in the coming years, followed closely by the Australian Trade Coast, which includes the airport and the Port of Brisbane area.
Okay, so this is, when you look at how and why markets move, there's a whole bunch of factors which will influence that, and where people are working or employment growth or where jobs are being created is a critical one. It's interesting to see. In Brisbane, Brisbane is very much based off its natural resources as well. A lot of the wealth flows from right across Queensland into Brisbane. So when I ever go up there, you look at the skyline, there's always stuff going in and new companies going up. So what's the job growth potential like there in the CBD? Is it pretty good?
Yeah, look, the economic development plan shows that there's good prospects for future growth opportunities in Brisbane. The types of employment opportunities have also changed significantly in the last 20 years in Brisbane. We used to be largely driven by manufacturing. Now the majority of employment opportunities are in professional services and also financial services. So the types of employment opportunities are starting to change in Brisbane, and therefore we're seeing future opportunities develop more. We are the baby sister city of Sydney and Melbourne, but we're also the growth or the first entry point for a lot of Asian countries. And with the opening of the second airport runway, that's going to promote further relationships directly with Asia. So there are plans to make Brisbane the next world city. That's part of the Brisbane development plan. And we certainly, see that with the infrastructure that's going in and the way that the local government is working with the state government, there's lots of upside opportunity in Brisbane.
And this all bodes well for Brisbane. And we go back to the point I made around what shapes capital growth values and livability and all that sort of stuff. So one of them is employment. But, this next misconception is you might think runs not in parallel with that point around employment, is that proximity to the CBD is the only driver of capital growth. So what we're saying is that if all the jobs are going to be decentralised but actually happen in the CBD, wouldn't it make sense then to invest in the CBD as a property investor, because that's where people want to live?
Yeah, look, I think the importance is accessibility to the employment hubs, not necessarily living on top of the employment hubs. And, right now, people that are living outside of the Brisbane local government area, more than 90% of them are commuting by car into the CBD. We expect that will have to change, and with that change will come accessibility to public transport. So commute times in Brisbane have doubled in the last 10 years, so that's only going to get worse as our population increases. So really it's about accessibility to those employment hubs and ensuring that you're not looking at Brisbane as it is today, but looking at Brisbane as it's going to look 10, 15 or 20 years from now, depending on your investment timeframe.
So that many people drive cars around in Brisbane? Because whenever I've been up there, it's a nightmare, the roads. Like, there's always traffic. And are they doing much to fix that, or is it they're trying to get more like trains and buses and that sort of stuff in there?
Yeah, so we've got the construction of the Cross River Rail happening right now. The Metro is funded. That's going to be a 2-minute service from 8 Mile Plains to the south up to Hurston Royal Brisbane Hospital to the north, with plans to extend that through to Kedron on the north. So there's infrastructure is happening and it's underway, but the population is accelerating so fast, it's whether the infrastructure can keep up. And in the meantime, there may be some, more significant delays that commuters can expect. So
looking at, the whole Brisbane landscape and where to invest in this proximity to the CBD is the only driver of capital growth. How do you get beyond flood-affected properties? Are they an absolute no-no, or as an investor, is there any time you should be investing in properties in floodplains?
I think it depends on an investor's risk profile, to be absolutely honest. A lot of investors that are looking for development upside, there's so many restrictions around future development when you're looking at flood impact or overland flow, because site accessibility is important. For investors that just want a standard buy and hold, it really depends on whether they're willing to accept increased risk, because there are increased holding costs in Brisbane associated with insuring a flood impacted property. And there's also increased cost to a tenant who occupies that property for their content insurance. So all of those factors need to be considered when an investor's considering an opportunity in a flood zone, but that's something that we would identify and point out to an investor. And if it's a deal breaker, then we just eliminate those properties up front. It
goes to show that not all properties created equal. And our point number 5 here of misconceptions about the Brisbane property market, one for you, Scott. Good investments, inverted commas, are solid homes made of brick and concrete.
Yeah, from a builder's side of things, Brisbane is a lot of your properties closer to the CBD are tin and timber. That's just the type of city that it is. The Queenslanders up on the stilts, slats underneath, compared to Sydney in those areas where they are brick and tile. It's not so much just about the type of property, but the location. Yeah. And to get closer to the CBD, tin and timber is just as strong, if not better or equal to the brick and tile type of house.
And we can get into some of the specifics around that in a moment, but as a Sydney sider, I've bought stuff up in Brisbane, as I mentioned, and I'm trying to think of them. Most of them are brick, and I got one that's like nearly a bunker, but I've got some Queensland stuff up there as well, Queenslander stuff as well. And I don't really think it persuaded or shaped my view of it too much, to be honest with you. What do most sort of Sydney people or Melbourne people think when they go up there? They sort of get concerned about it?
Yeah, a lot of them do. I guess they look at maintenance type of things. Your difference between your brick and your timber sort of things, they do think there's a lot more maintenance involved in it. But generally, when you have a timber building, the paint on it will last approximately 10 years. So look, they're still solid. They are fairly low maintenance anyway, and you can do a lot with them.
And are they sort of character homes? Is it really hard with sort of, they don't really like you knocking them down either, right? They like to keep the streetscapes in some of the, because in beautiful suburbs up in Brisbane, it'd be a shame to see all these buildings go.
Yeah, exactly. There is a lot of character homes up that way. They are protected that way. So it is good for the city to keep that character involved in it and the history as well.
So this the next point around misconceptions about the Brisbane property market, point number 6, and this is connected in with it. Investors should avoid properties containing asbestos. So Queensland's just full of asbestos. It's the asbestos state, isn't it?
It is. I mean, as I said, the houses, the way they were built back then, a lot of them involve asbestos. A house I live in, we've got a Queenslander ourselves. There's a lot of asbestos in it. Asbestos is only dangerous when it is broken up and the fibres are airborne. If you just keep the paint on them, and they are actually quite solid, and they're a very solid type of construction.
And when you're looking at properties, Melinda, that do have asbestos, is that something that you note pretty early on? Do you use that as a negotiation point, or it's just assumed that asbestos is asbestos is asbestos? It's just how you deal with it?
Yeah, we don't use it as a negotiation point, or we wouldn't be able to purchase properties because, as I mentioned, most properties do have asbestos. But, Scott has an eye to identify whether a property contains asbestos. It's up to us to bring that to the attention of our client. It's not a deal breaker, but it's just important for landowners or property owners to know in case they do plan any future works, because there is an increased cost associated with, removing that product from a home.
And how do you feel about it, Scott? You must have dealt a lot with it, your sort of game, being a builder, removal of asbestos. As long as you're adequately prepared with the right safety precautions, you personally, you're happy dealing with asbestos?
Yeah, I mean, and as Melinda said, whether it's a knockdown of a house or even simple thing like putting downlights in, as long as you've got someone that is trained and knows and that are qualified to do the work, it's very safe, and it's nothing to be a deal breaker and to be concerned about.
But don't sort of Google what does asbestos look like and go, I think that's okay. You probably need to get someone in to do that.
Yeah, correct. And prices have dropped as well. Previously, in years gone by, it was really expensive to deal with asbestos, and now those prices are actually quite reasonable.
And do you use a special asbestos firm to come in and do this stuff, or
Yeah, only qualified people. Yeah.
How do you know someone's qualified? Like, what do you ask them?
So they will have all the licensing for it.
Okay.
Yeah, to be qualified to remove or deal with any asbestos.
Okay. Oh. Yeah, I've done some stuff, renos on asbestos, and everyone said, do you reckon there's an unnecessary scare about it all, or there is the required amount of sensibility of awareness around? I think most people now know, don't mess with it, right?
Yeah, I think at my age, I probably messed with it previously as a carpenter, working for my dad and things like that. But I think nowadays, we're a lot smarter, and we are very careful and cautious that what it can actually cause.
Yeah, and if you are unsure, my recommendation is speak to the experts, because you just don't want to be playing that space if you're doing a renos yourself. I'm going to move on to number 7, but we're going to go to a quick break beforehand. Back in a moment.
If you're a regular listener to the Smart Property Investment Show, then odds are you're already a property fanatic who loves hearing stories on investing from real people, the good, the bad and the ugly. Be with people just like you and join the group Passionate Property Investors on Facebook now. Become part of a community who know what to do and when to do it. And the time to do it is now. Passionate Property Investors. Tribe, tools and tips. Find us on Facebook today.
Welcome back to the Smart Property Investment Show. I'm here with Scott, Melinda, Jennison, Streamline Property Buyers. We've just been chatting asbestos and how you need to be sensible about it. Don't be a home handyman when you're dealing with that sort of stuff. You've got to get the experts in. Scott, we spoke on point number 5 that good investments are solid homes made of brick and concrete. And I think that's a misconception that we've quelled. But sort of most people's relationship with that point would be point number 7, which is timber homes should be avoided because of the risk of termite damage. Everyone thinks timber homes up in Queensland or in Brisbane are riddled with termites. They love the stuff. What's your view of it all?
So again, termites, they're everywhere. So the best thing to do is actually protection, perimeter barriers, things like that. People don't really understand how termites work. So if you have a brick house, generally a lot of them are brick veneer.
Yep.
So brick skin, timber inside, timber fittings, so door frames, architraves around the windows and doors, and also your roof. So termites are quite smart. They won't just go and eat the bottom of the house. They actually go to the top and they work their way out. They don't want to chew the bottom and let it all collapse on top of them. So they're actually quite smart that they will get into the top part of the house and they'll actually work their way out.
It's really funny. So you start talking about termites, my head got itchy. That's funny. So are you scared of termites? Like not from I feel maybe you are, maybe you got a phobia for them, but like, can you go into a house and know, do you expect when you're looking at a house, do you expect to find termites in Brisbane?
I think in any house, not just Brisbane, but in any house, there would be some type of history or could be some type of history of termites. And as I said earlier, with the perimeter barriers, that's something that we highly recommend to all our clients is to have a perimeter treatment so that, and generally nowadays, they could last up to about 8 to 10 years. To me, it's a really good insurance to have on your property.
So what is a perimeter barrier? What do they do? Drill some holes down and put some gunk in there?
Yeah, so they drill holes around the outside of the building. Unless there's a visual barrier that you can actually see the concrete section that goes up to the slab, basically, then they'll drill around the outside of the property and they'll inject a chemical in there. And that updated as I say, can nowadays be up to about 8 to 10 years that they last.
So that's on slab building. What about Queenslanders? Can they still do the same protection around something like that on stilts?
Yeah, they can. A lot of your stilts are protected from an ant capping. So once they go up, there's an ant capping, a metal capping, which they don't eat and they can't climb around. They're designed so that to stop the termites climbing up and over. And that's your barrier that stops them from going up as well.
So when you're looking at a place and considering investing, you want to be seeing these type of things or ask the question about what termite stuff's been done so far.
Correct, yeah.
But when you walk into a property and go, this thing's termite damaged, no one wants it, do you see sort of a good investment?
Yeah, there's opportunity.
Yeah.
If it's had some sort of history, and it will always have it, if even the next person that comes along, it'll probably come up in a building and pest. So it can be fixed. It's just being smart enough to know what it is to stop them coming in and prevent them and then to rectify the problem.
I've got some experience with some termite. I always see opportunity in termite damage, right? And I've got some great stuff as a result of like really cheap. And, fortunately I can lean on people who are builders who can look at it. Like, I look at something and that looks really expensive to build, but you might just go, that's easy. Just got to prop it up, put a new beam in, happy days, fix it $500. It's not that. It's varying degrees of it, but it's not that difficult to fix termite damage if it's not too extensive.
No, very simple, really, yeah.
And you use it as a big negotiation point? You try and hunt down termites and scare people going, can't do that. What's your thoughts, Melinda?
Oh, I think some of the sales agents in Brisbane now know, because Scott is a licensed builder, that if something does fall away on a building and pest inspection for whatever reason, they can give us a call and see whether we would have any interest. I think the common theme that we always say to our clients is you cannot change the location, but the property itself is just the income producing part of the asset. So if there's something wrong with the property that can potentially cause us to negotiate harder on price, providing that it is able to be fixed, then it's certainly not an opportunity that we would pass up. So it all comes down to whether, the opportunity presents as a good investment for our clients' individual goals. If the location works, if we can negotiate out the price for any rectification works, then, we can push ahead.
And we've been chatting mainly about houses here, or, timber-based houses, which is very common up in Brizzy. Are you mainly house on a block of land type people, or are you quite happy sort of dabbling in that flat market? Not that popular really in Brizzy. How do you see all that?
Yeah, look, we've not actually purchased a unit or townhouse for any of our clients to date.
Okay.
Partially due to the current environment. We've had a massive oversupply in Brisbane in that landscape. So, we haven't felt that there's been any opportunity certainly for capital growth in that market. And therefore, most of the properties that we've been purchasing for clients have been in the single dwellings on their own block of land, remembering that the land is the part of the asset that appreciates and the building depreciates. So we're certainly looking for the maximum value in the land.
And part of that sort of maximum value in the land, and misconception number 8 is adding a granny flat is a good way to improve investor returns. So if you're buying houses, which on a big block of land, the trend is sort of, it's dropped a little bit, but everyone was chucking granny flats on anything with a bit of grass in the backyard, in Sydney at least, and I know up in Brizzy. What's your views on that? Is it a good way to go ahead, or when would you want to put a granny flat on a property?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I think it depends a lot on the individual investor again and what they're trying to achieve with the property and what their time frame is. Certainly for any investors that are purchasing in the Brisbane local government area, whilst you can build a granny flat on the property, it's illegal to rent that granny flat out under a separate tenancy agreement. So you can only have the extra income associated with, for example, an extra bedroom, but it can't be rented out separately. So if you're going for a yield play, it's not going to work in the Brisbane LGA. If you're moving out to some of the other areas, Ipswich, Logan, Moreton, there is the opportunity to build granny flats and rent them out separately. It does come down to what an investor has in mind to exit their portfolio. So if they're looking to hold the portfolio, hold the asset for income, it could be a strategy that some people might consider. But if you are looking to sell, you've always got to consider the largest segment of the market, and that are the owner-occupiers. And adding a granny flat generally eliminates a lot of owner-occupiers because they don't have a need for that sort of thing in their backyard. So I think it's really dependent on the investor and what their individual goals are and what their strategy is.
That's a really interesting point. So within the Brisbane LGA, it's illegal to rent out. So you can't have a separate tenancy agreement for a 2-bedroom granny flat in your backyard.
That's correct.
I reckon a lot of people slipped up on that quite a lot.
They absolutely do.
Yeah. And do you see those properties, do you see them for sale within the Brisbane LGA and just go, it's a definite no-no?
It's not a common thing in Brisbane at all. And I do think that there's a lot of noise in the market at the moment about purchase properties in Brisbane. It's got granny flat potential. The reality is that the demand for that type of product is not very high. Also, even out of Brisbane, if you are putting a granny flat in the backyard and, you know, potentially renting 2 dwellings out separately, the income that you may generate on the original home may need to be reduced on the basis that you've now got a reduced backyard size, but also, you know, neighbours literally on your back deck.
It's a really interesting point. One of the other, you know, a similar theme to this is around house and land packages. Like brand new house and land packages in greenfield locations will provide good capital growth opportunities for investors. Now, a lot of people have been up in Brisbane selling house and land packages, and I've been keeping an eye on it. And sort of connected with the granny flat is that a lot of them are these sort of dual key, what do they call them, dual key properties, dual occupancy. And these are out in the, I'm not going to say out in the sticks, but they're sort of
out in the sticks.
They're out in the sticks. So, you know, brand new houses on a block of land. You've got a 1-bedroom-ish self-contained flat and a 3 to 4 bedroom house, and they're selling like hotcakes. And people think they're great locations because you get 2 incomes on it, but there is so much land out that way that the sort of downward pressure to ensure that you're getting price growth doesn't always happen. How are you seeing it, Melinda?
I do agree. And again, depending on what an investor is putting their money into property for, if it is for a yield play, then it might be a strategy they can consider. But if they are looking for capital growth, it's very high risk. You know, we've done some analysis previously or read some studies on broad hectare land supply throughout southeast Queensland. What we've found is Ipswich as a local government area is providing about 28% of the future land supply. Logan's got about 30% of the future land supply. This is across southeast Queensland. And the Gold Coast Council have got about 15%. So, you know, you add those up, that's about 75% of southeast Queensland's future land supply is through the south and western corridors from Brisbane. And a lot of those areas are where you'll find a lot of those dual occupancy homes. Also, that's where there's a lot of new estates being constructed. And the important thing for investors to understand is the balance between supply and demand. And whilst these are growth corridors in terms of population growth, it's really important when people are defining growth, what is it? Population growth does not in itself improve property values, especially when there is such a huge amount of future supply potential.
And I completely agree with you. And an interesting point to throw into that also is one of their earlier misconceptions. There's this density of Brisbane. So you're talking about a whole bunch of infill areas. So where there is suburbs, there is locations already established, and they might have been established for 100 years or so. There is still a lot of land in there which is going to get filled in as well. So you've got these two things working in unison. I imagine that will fill before these newer suburbs out sort of southwest come into it. It's hard for investors. You really need to be informed about this sort of stuff because there's some very slick salespeople selling greenfield site locations out those ways.
Absolutely. And some of the potential clients that I speak to tell me about some of the tricks that they use. But it's just important for people to understand not just what Brisbane looks like now, but what the potential for Brisbane is. And we can get into that with clients by helping them understand based on, you know, a lot of the Southeast Queensland plans, regional plans, infrastructure plans, local government plans, neighbourhood plans, city plans. There's so many things that help to define the future direction of a city. And that's what our local knowledge can help people to understand.
And I think also you're talking about like greenfield sites where they're still putting in. You've got places like Springfield, which is the biggest master plan sort of area in all of Australia by memory, and there's still a lot to go there, right? Like there is still a lot of land even in that particular area, which is a lot closer to the CBD, some of the other areas we're talking about. So how do you weigh up, how do you balance sort of getting into that sort of market versus one of these greenfield type things?
Yeah, look, it's a good question. And I think it's all about, what is the potential future supply around those locations? What are the employment opportunities? What are the likely future growth drivers? And what is the accessibility like to the employment hubs? And they're all of the things that you have to weigh up when you're looking at one location versus another.
And we'll close with this point number 10 around top 10 misconceptions about the Brisbane property market. I see the headlines now on Smart Property Investment. It's going to be easy to articulate all this stuff. And Scott, I might put this one to you and sort of form a bit of a conversation for the next minute or so. Property data can accurately determine the performance of specific suburbs over the long term. Now, we've spoken about what's happening in the market right now, what you're seeing on the ground truth. So what's happening today isn't necessarily seen in property data that's coming through. That can often take 3, 6, whatever months to actually see that. But you put that against the fact of on the ground truth of looking at properties, looking at their investability, looking at their building capability, whether or not they've got termites or whatever it is. How do you go about balancing what you see in front of you when you look at a property versus the noise that comes out of property data?
Yeah, well, as you said earlier, Melinda's the brains trust and she's the researcher with all the data. So she does a lot of that work. But what we see being local on the ground is the demand on properties. For example, we at an open house about a week ago, there was 38 groups through. And it was like being at a school fete. There was so many people running around the house. And that's in an area that's close to the city, really high demand. But the median price for that area is actually quite low, because people that buy in that area don't actually sell. They get the nice house, they keep the nice house, and the properties that are selling there are the renovators and the development opportunities. So that's where that misconception of the data is.
Yeah, I think it's a term that people often use is compositional bias. So, in some of these premium locations, you've got 400 square metre blocks of land selling right next door to 800 square metre blocks. Some properties are completely unrenovated. Some properties are high-end city views. All of that data is joined together effectively, and the median number is plucked out. And remembering that the median is simply the middle score when you're looking at a data set. Data is only as good as the composition of what it's made up of. So it can be definitely a very misleading indicator, and it's important to understand not just what the numbers tell you, but what that is actually made up of, and therefore how it should be interpreted.
So we've had a look at the top 10 misconceptions about the Brisbane property market, and lots of information there. We'll keep sort of writing about it on smartpropertyinvestment.com.au, but you're, Melinda, focused on Brisbane. So all these things that we've sort of spoken about, and we'll fill this in, and maybe you can write a piece for us on this as well where you can crystallise all this information. I think our listeners would really appreciate that. But why Brisbane? Like some of this you can think is quite negative, some of it you can think is quite positive, depends the way you see the world. But why Brisbane compared to anywhere else in Australia right now? Why should investors be there?
I think the opportunity in Brisbane is really based on where it sits in the property cycle. So whereas Sydney and Melbourne, the other two large property markets in Australia, have had fairly significant price growth over the last few years, except for the last couple of years where there's been, small declines in value, Brisbane didn't see that same price growth. And the one thing that has been missing from Brisbane largely is that economic growth and the employment opportunity. Now we're starting to see a lot more demand for property. We're seeing it on the ground, but it is driven by the economic growth. It's driven by population growth. It's driven by those sea changes that are wanting to come up and, make more of the lifestyle that we have up in Brisbane. But we've also had a period of oversupply, so that does impact property markets. We had apartments that, too many apartments were built at the same time, so we had too much supply, not enough demand, and that softened prices or flatlined prices. The exact opposite is happening now. So construction commencements just this week, the latest data came out. It's reduced again in Brisbane. And, we've got reducing supply, we've got increasing demand. The basics of economics suggest that that's likely to put upward pressure on prices. And every property market is at a different cycle. So, okay.
Well, we'll keep chatting. You let us know what's going on up there. And I haven't seen any of my properties that I have up there, by the way. I really should go up there at some point. I was in the area once and I sort of went, I couldn't be bothered. I think I had a hangover and I went, I'm not going to worry about it. I'll do it next time I'm up there. But I really appreciate you guys coming down and have a chat with us today around the top misconceptions about the Brisbane property market. As I said, we'll get this up on smartpropertyinvestment.com.au, but really appreciate you guys coming in. Thanks so much for your time.
Thanks
for
again,
having us,
Phil.
Phil.
No worries. Remember to check out smartpropertyinvestment.com.au. If you're not yet subscribing to our daily morning newsletter, so the first to know what's happening in property right across Australia, including Brisbane, smartpropertyinvestment.com.au. We're also on social media. Just search Smart Property HQ. And I know Scott and Melinda are going to do this as soon as they finish what we're doing here. They're going to leave a review on our, wherever you're listening to this podcast. The team here get a real kick out of it. As I've said beforehand, it's just not me sort of standing behind a microphone talking. There's a big team here who produce this and do great work. So they really enjoy the feedback. So wherever you listen to it, give us a review. We'd really appreciate it. We'll be back again next time. Until then, bye-bye.
The information featured in this podcast is general in nature and does not take into consideration your financial situation or individual needs and should not be relied upon. Before making any investment, insurance, tax, property or financial planning decision, you should consult a licensed professional who can advise whether your decision is appropriate for you. Guests appearing on this podcast may have a commercial relationship with the companies mentioned.
We get it. You're here listening to the Smart Property Investment Show and you're being interrupted by this ad. We value your ears just as much as your eyeballs, so we'll be quick. Join passionate property investors on Facebook today and we'll fill your Facebook feed with useful tips and tools, plus free education from industry experts and a tribe of people who get it. Passionate property investors. Find us on Facebook now.